Hey folks, before the video starts, I want to say big thank you for the feedback you gave me in the last video. Again, I will be short and say, as every other video, to leave a like and hit the subscribe button. Also, don't forget to comment down below, helping me to give proof to YouTube that all of you who follow this channel so far are real people who watch my videos. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy. I was paid to record paranormal activity from a dark website in an abandoned hospital. The camera caught something standing behind me. I've always been a bit of a thrill seeker, the kind of guy who'd spend nights scrolling through Reddit's No Sleep or trying those stupid challenges that my friends swore no one in their right mind would do. But this was different. It started with a thread I stumbled upon late one night, buried deep in a forum dedicated to bizarre deep web experiences. Someone had mentioned a site hidden in the murkiest corners of the dark web that paid handsomely for raw, authentic footage of paranormal locations. Now, I'm no stranger to the ghost hunting content that clogs up YouTube, but this was different. It promised more than cheap jump scares. It was supposed to be real. I don't remember why I went as far as I did that night. Maybe it was the desperation in the post's wording, like it was begging someone, anyone, to take the job. Or maybe it was the thought of making a couple of grand in a weekend. Rent wasn't getting cheaper, and the gig economy had me scraping by on coffee and instant noodles. So, I followed the cryptic instructions to the site. The site was minimalistic to the point of discomfort. Just a black screen with white, typewriter-like text that read, "Do you believe in ghosts?" A box blinked below, waiting for my input. I typed yes, barely hesitating. The page refreshed, and a new prompt appeared. Prove it. A few clicks later, I was looking at a job listing, seeking individual to film overnight inside St. Magnus Hospital. $2,500 upfront, $5,000 upon review of footage. St. Magnus. I shivered. It was the type of local legend that parents used to scare their kids into staying home after dark. Boarded up, abandoned for over 30 years, and rumored to be haunted by the patients who'd suffered unimaginable treatment within its crumbling walls. Some said it was an old tuberculosis ward where patients were left to rot. Others whispered about the secret psychiatric experiments. All I knew was that nobody sane went there, especially after the sun went down. But money talks. I found myself agreeing to the job with the click of a button, and within seconds, an address appeared on my screen. A single sentence followed. Bring a camera and go alone. The next morning, I picked up a basic camcorder from a pawn shop downtown. The old guy behind the counter gave me a weird look when I explained where I was going. He muttered something in Spanish, too fast for me to catch. All I understood was mala idea before he handed me the bag, eyes cast downward. That night, as I packed my bag with the camera, a flashlight, and an old Swiss Army knife, comfort more than anything, I got a notification on my laptop. $2,500 credited to your account. There was no turning back now. The hospital stood at the edge of town, half consumed by the woods that surrounded it, like nature was trying to swallow it whole. The parking lot was cracked and littered with weeds, and the building loomed over me with its shattered windows, like eyes, cold and hollow. My pulse drummed in my ears as I walked up to the front entrance, the beam from my flashlight jittering with my shaking hands. I swear I heard whispers in the wind, but I brushed it off. The mind plays tricks when it's scared, right? The door creaked open, protesting as if it hadn't been disturbed in years. Inside, the air was thick, metallic, with a smell I can only describe as rust and rot. My flashlight swept over peeling paint, medical gurneys tipped on their sides, and graffiti that screamed, "Get out," in blood-red letters. I set the camera on a tripod in the center of what used to be the main reception area and pressed record. The red light blinked on, and suddenly, the silence seemed even more oppressive. The only sounds were my own breathing and the faint groan of the old building adjusting to the wind. I'd been here for about an hour, pacing, cracking nervous jokes into the camera to keep my mind from spiraling, when I heard it. A faint, scraping sound, like nails dragging across concrete. I froze. The sound was coming from down the hallway to my left, the one leading to the patient rooms. I strained my ears, holding my breath until my lungs screamed for air. There it was again, closer this time, accompanied by a rhythmic thump-thump. I couldn't move. My feet felt cemented to the floor, but my brain was screaming at me to grab the camera and run. Instead, I did the dumbest thing I could have possibly done. I called out, "Hello?" The scraping stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. I felt watched, like 100 unseen eyes were trained on me, dissecting every quiver of my voice and shift of my weight. I swallowed hard, my throat dry as paper. My flashlight beam trembled as I shone it down the corridor. There was nothing there, just a gaping void. Then, in the corner of my eye, the red light on the camera blinked faster, almost erratically. I turned to face it, my heart pounding so loudly I thought it might drown out reality. I reached for the camera, about to hit stop and get the hell out of there, when I noticed something on the small flip screen. It was my reflection, shadowy and faint, but unmistakably me. Except, there was something else. Standing behind me, just on the edge of the frame, was a shape, dark and tall, with something like a face, too pale, eyes too wide, staring directly into the camera. And then, in a voice that felt like an ice-cold blade against my spine, a whisper filled the room. "You're not alone." I didn't scream. I couldn't. My throat tightened, refusing to let out anything but a shaky gasp. My fingers fumbled with the camera, trembling as I hit the stop button. The whisper still hung in the air, slicing through the silence like a razor. My flashlight flickered, a stutter in the beam that made the shadows around me twist and dance. I spun around, expecting to see whatever it was behind me, teeth bared, eyes empty and endless. But there was nothing there. Just the same eerie emptiness of the hospital's decaying lobby. The rational part of my brain, what was left of it anyway, told me it had to be a trick of the light, an echo from outside, something mundane. But as I stood there, straining to hear even the faintest sound, the silence grew suffocating. The only thing breaking it was my heartbeat, thundering in my ears like a war drum. "Get it together, man," I muttered, more to convince myself than anything else. I glanced at the camera, the screen now blank. The playback icon glared at me, a digital dare to relive what I'd just seen. I swallowed the lump in my throat, fingers hesitating over the button. Maybe it was better not to know. Maybe it was smarter to pack up and leave, to pretend this was just some stupid urban legend and nothing more. But curiosity is a wicked thing. It gnaws at the mind, whispers doubts when you're alone in the dark. I hit play. The footage rolled, grainy in the dim light. The main reception area looked even more sinister on screen, the darkness seeping into the edges like ink. I watched myself pace, nervous laughter bubbling up as I cracked some forgettable joke, my flashlight's beam sweeping over the broken gurneys and shattered glass. The audio picked up my breathing, shallow and quick. Then, just as before, the scraping sound echoed down the hallway. It was clearer in the recording, sharp and deliberate. A long pause. Then I saw myself turn, flashlight pointed down that cursed hallway. The red light of the camera reflected in my eyes, catching the terror I was too proud to admit at the time. And then, it happened. The shadow moved into view. A shape. A figure. It stood motionless at the edge of the frame, gaunt and impossibly tall, limbs too long, skin stretched over bone like wax. Its eyes, wide and glassy, glistened as if wet, staring not at me, but directly into the lens. The audio crackled, distorted, and that whisper, that bone-chilling, icy whisper, slithered through the speaker. "You're not alone." The video cut off abruptly, like the camera had decided to save me from seeing more. I didn't remember pressing stop at that moment, but the footage confirmed it. Whatever it was, it had been real. The breath I hadn't realized I was holding escaped in a shudder, leaving me lightheaded and shaky. I shoved the camera into my bag, the movement jerky and desperate. My mind screamed to run, to leave the hospital and never look back. But as I grabbed my flashlight and turned toward the exit, a sound stopped me in my tracks. A laugh. Not a laugh of joy or humor, but a rasping, hollow chuckle, like dry leaves scraping over pavement. It came from behind me, from down that dark hallway. I felt the urge to bolt, but my body wouldn't move. My feet were cemented to the floor, paralyzed by fear so intense it felt like drowning. The laugh came again, closer this time, echoing in a way that made it hard to tell where it started or ended. And then, the sound of footsteps, slow, shuffling steps, dragging across the floor as if the person making them could barely lift their feet. I turned, flashlight trembling as I pointed it toward the corridor. The beam caught nothing but dust swirling in the air, illuminated like tiny ghosts. The sound stopped. My eyes darted around the hallway, searching for any sign of movement, but it was like staring into a black hole. "Hello?" The word left my lips before I could stop it, carried on a breath that trembled with the weight of my fear. The answer wasn't what I expected. It wasn't another laugh or the shuffling steps, but a voice, soft, almost delicate, but warped with an edge that made my skin crawl. It whispered my name. Alex. My flashlight dropped as my hand spasmed in shock. The thud echoed through the reception, followed by the skittering clatter as it rolled across the floor, its light swinging wildly until it finally came to rest, casting a long, crooked shadow down the hallway. The shadow moved, but I didn't. It slid along the wall, elongated and unnatural, until it stepped out into the light. And there it was, the same thing I'd seen on the camera. A figure, impossibly tall, its limbs dangling at odd angles, head tilted as if trying to mimic a human gesture, but failing. Its eyes found mine and locked on, glistening with that same wet, glassy stare. My breath hitched, throat too tight to let out the scream clawing its way up. I stumbled back, my foot catching on the edge of a broken gurney. The crash was enough to snap me out of my paralysis, and I scrambled for my flashlight, fingers slipping over the cold metal as the thing took a step toward me. That hollow, scraping step. The light finally caught in my grip, and I pointed it directly at the figure. but it was gone. The hallway was empty. The silence fell again, so complete it pressed against my eardrums like deep water. I didn't wait for another sign. I didn't pause to catch my breath. I bolted, my shoes pounding against the cracked tiles as I sprinted to the entrance. The door, old and heavy, felt like it took an eternity to pull open, but I didn't dare look back. The night air hit me like a wave, and I staggered into the overgrown parking lot, chest heaving. The silence of the hospital was replaced by the chirping of crickets and the rustle of leaves. The world felt brighter, more vivid, but the chill in my spine didn't ease. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on my couch, staring at the camera in my bag, replaying that footage over and over in my mind, that voice whispering my name, the glassy, hollow eyes. The sensation of being watched didn't leave, even as the first light of dawn crept through my window. It didn't leave when I locked the doors, or even when I checked them 3 times, and then, just as my exhausted mind began to drift off, my phone buzzed with a notification. Footage received, review in progress, payment pending, and below that, another message. Good job, Alex. We knew you wouldn't be alone. The message on my phone blurred as my vision trembled with fatigue and fear. The morning sunlight streaming through my window did little to banish the chill that had wrapped itself around my bones. I read the words again, trying to convince myself they weren't real, that maybe exhaustion was tricking my eyes. But there they were, stark and unwavering. Good job, Alex. We knew you wouldn't be alone. I couldn't shake the sense that the sender had been watching me, that whoever or whatever was behind this job knew exactly what I'd seen in St. Magnus, maybe even more than I did. I rubbed my eyes and put the phone down, fighting the urge to throw it across the room. The $5,000 promised for the footage was nowhere near worth what I'd experienced, what I'd witnessed. Sleep was impossible. Every time I shut my eyes, I saw those glassy eyes staring back at me, that emaciated figure lurking just out of reach. The whisper of my name replayed in my mind, a haunting loop that made my heart race every time. So, I did the only thing I could think of. I decided to dig deeper. It didn't take long for me to realize that St. Magnus Hospital had more layers of horror than the rumors let on. I sifted through old news articles, archives, anything I could find. Most pieces were vague, mentioning that it had closed down after a series of mysterious patient deaths, all written off as natural causes, despite whispers of malpractice. But the deeper I dove, the more I stumbled onto stories that made my skin prickle. Missing patients, nurses who supposedly went mad, rambling about, the eyes in the shadows, a doctor who hung himself in the East Wing, scribbling, "We are never alone," in shaky handwriting on the walls before he died. The forum that had led me to the job was buzzing with new posts, like vultures gathering for a feast. Users speculated wildly, throwing out theories ranging from ghosts to government experiments. One user, under the name Shadow Seeker 34, seemed to have more insight than anyone else. They posted an ominous message that caught my attention. Those who record the silence awaken what was meant to stay asleep. That was it, the final shove I needed. I reached out, messaging them directly. "What do you know about St. Magnus? I need answers." The reply came almost instantly. "It's not the place, it's the attention. When you shine a light, it looks back. You've already seen it, haven't you? Be careful, or it will follow you home." A shiver danced up my spine. My eyes darted to the camera bag, which now felt less like evidence and more like a curse. every instinct I had screamed at me to ditch the footage, to bury it somewhere it would never be found. But the logical part of me, the one that hadn't been clouded by sleepless nights and paranoia, argued that it was my proof, the only thing that confirmed I hadn't imagined any of it. Hours turned into days, and the sun began to feel like an illusion, something distant and irrelevant. Shadows stretched across my apartment with every passing hour, morphing into familiar shapes. Shapes I had seen at St. Magnus. Shapes that had watched me through the camera lens. Then the disturbances started. At first, it was subtle. The creak of a floorboard when I was standing perfectly still, or the soft tap-tap of something I couldn't locate. My rational mind blamed the old building, the way it settled and groaned as temperatures changed. But at night, rationality melted away. I'd wake up to the sound of my name, whispered so close it felt like breath on my ear. Alex. The voice was unmistakable. It was the same one from the hospital, the one that had called out from the shadows. One night, the whisper turned into a giggle, dry and fragmented, like the laugh from St. Magnus. I threw my blankets off and turned on every light in the apartment, panting and covered in cold sweat. The camera. I knew I had to check the footage again, but the thought of seeing that thing, those eyes, paralyzed me. It was as if just acknowledging it might give it more power, but ignorance was no longer an option. I set the camera on my desk and pressed play, my fingers numb as they hovered over the stop button, ready to cut the playback short. This time, the footage didn't stop at the hallway. After I turned to run, the camera kept rolling, recording the faintest outline of movement. The figure stepped fully into the frame, those long limbs dragging it forward, eyes staring, mouth splitting into a grin that stretched impossibly wide. And then, the whisper, clear as day. I'm here now. The screen flickered, and the audio cut out with a burst of static. But before the footage ended, there was a single frame that made my blood run cold. It was a shot of my apartment, dimly lit and unmistakably mine. And in the corner, by the window, was the figure, eyes wide, watching me through the screen as if I were the recording. The knock on my door snapped me back to reality so hard, I nearly fell out of my chair. 3 knocks, evenly spaced, as if whoever was on the other side had all the time in the world. I forced myself to move, inching toward the door, the sound of my heartbeat drumming in my ears. The peephole showed nothing but darkness, a black void where the hallway should be. My fingers gripped the door handle, slick with sweat, and I waited, listening. The knocks came again, and then a voice, soft, amused, and familiar. Alex, let me in. My fingers froze around the doorknob as if welded there. The voice on the other side was soft and patient, dripping with a confidence that told me it had nowhere else to be. Time ground to a halt, my body poised in a state between fight and flight, though my mind screamed for the latter. The apartment was dead silent, except for the subtle creak of the floorboards beneath my feet and the low, rhythmic thumping of my heart against my ribs. The voice came again, quieter, more insistent. Alex, you're waiting, aren't you? A wave of nausea rolled through me. I wanted to believe it was a prank, that someone from the dark web had tracked me down and decided to push my buttons for a sick joke. But deep down, I knew better. This wasn't just some twisted human game. It was whatever I'd seen in the hospital, now standing on the other side of my front door. A sudden noise, like a fingernail scraping lightly against wood, made me jerk back. I released the doorknob, my hand throbbing from the death grip I'd had on it. The scraping continued, slow and deliberate, tracing the outline of the frame. My eyes darted to the camera, sitting on the desk across the room. Its red recording light was off, but the screen still glowed, showing the last frame, the image of the figure by my window. My stomach twisted as I realized that I could see a reflection in the dark screen of my TV, and it wasn't just me. The reflection showed me standing by the door, eyes wide with fear, but behind me, at the edge of the room, a figure loomed, tall, with limbs so elongated they reached almost to the floor. The eyes were just as I remembered them, wide, glassy, and far too knowing. The mouth was a thin, pale line, as if holding back a grin it could barely contain. I spun around, flashlight in hand, its weak beam struggling against the dim light of the room. Empty. The apartment was empty, but that reflection... I didn't dare look again. I backed into the living room, my hand blindly feeling along the surface of the desk until it closed around the camera. It felt heavier now, like a stone weighted with dread. The knocking had stopped, replaced by a silence so thick it buzzed in my ears. That's when I noticed something else, a sound so subtle it barely registered at first. Breathing. Not mine. It was too shallow, too slow, like someone savoring the air. I aimed the flashlight around the room, the beam shaking as it crossed over furniture, shadows stretching and compressing like dark, living things. The breathing persisted, coming from the direction of the window, where the figure had appeared in the footage. My mouth went dry as I pointed the light that way, its glow revealing nothing but the closed blinds, their edges curling from neglect. For a moment, hope bloomed in my chest. Maybe I was imagining it. Maybe the stress was finally snapping my grip on reality. Then, the blinds flooded, as if disturbed by a breeze from outside. Except the window wasn't open. The room felt colder, the type of chill that clings to the bones. Before I could even process it, something scraped across the glass, a sound like nails dragging in a lazy, almost teasing manner. My flashlight sputtered once, and in that split second before it steadied, I saw it, a dark silhouette, pressed close to the other side of the window. Its face was pale, smudged like charcoal, and the eyes, those awful eyes, stared straight into mine. It didn't blink. It didn't move. It simply watched, head tilted in that disturbingly human way. The flashlight fell from my hands, hitting the floor with a clatter that seemed to echo for miles. I stumbled back, catching myself on the desk as the figure's mouth began to move. I couldn't hear what it was saying, not at first, but the movement was slow and deliberate, forming syllables I recognized before the sound reached me. "Let me in, Alex." The whispered plea was almost gentle, like it was asking for a favor between friends. But there was a hunger in its eyes, a dark abyss that made me realize letting it in would mean something far worse than just seeing it face to face. My instincts screamed to flee, but the rational part of my mind warred with the fact that there was nowhere to go. I was trapped, cornered in my own home, my eyes locked onto the camera on the desk, as if it could somehow provide answers. With a burst of panic-fueled adrenaline, I grabbed it and switched it back to playback mode. The screen flickered as the last recording came to life. There I was, backing out of the hospital in a frantic blur, but this time I noticed something I hadn't before. As the camera jolted and swayed, it caught flashes of movement. Hands, dozens of them, reaching out from the walls, the ceiling, all clawing for the air. The figure with the wide eyes appeared again in the footage. moving closer to the lens. But this time, it didn't speak. It just smiled. The footage cut to black, and the camera screen filled with a single line of text that wasn't there before. You opened the door. The blood drained from my face as realization slammed into me. The knock at the door, the invitation. It was never just a test. I had already let it in. The room darkened, and the shadow that had been pressed against the window was now inside, blending seamlessly into the corners of my apartment. The whisper came again, low and reverberating through the silence. Thank you. The flashlight on the floor flickered one last time, and in that brief burst of light, I saw them. Hands emerging from the walls, pale and thin, pressing against the plaster, as if trying to break through. And standing among them was the figure, closer now, eyes wide and mouth stretched in that horrible grin. The whisper echoed in the room, bouncing off the walls like a chant. Thank you, Alex. The light died, and the darkness claimed everything. Darkness swallowed the room, smothering the weak pulse of light like a suffocating blanket. My eyes strained, darting from shadow to shadow, but all I could make out was the oppressive black pressing against me from all sides. The silence that followed was almost worse than the whispers, heavy and pregnant, with an anticipation that made my skin crawl. Somewhere in that void, something shifted. A whisper of movement, the soft rustle of fabric or skin dragging against the walls. I felt it before I saw anything, an electric charge in the air, a tingling awareness that told me I was not alone. My breath came in short, ragged gasps, each one amplifying the silence, making the darkness feel more alive, more suffocating. A cold touch brushed my arm, so faint that I almost convinced myself it was a breeze. But then it gripped, thin, brittle fingers, tightening just enough to confirm my worst fear. I recoiled, stumbling back into the desk with a thud that sent the camera tumbling to the floor. The impact must have jarred something inside it, because it whirred to life, casting a weak red glow that did little to pierce the darkness, but offered a sliver of comfort nonetheless. In that glow, I saw them, pale, ghostly hands pushing through the walls, fingers splayed like grotesque spiders. They moved as one, stretching and groping for something from me. My back hit the far wall, and I realized with gut-wrenching certainty that there was nowhere left to run. The room was a prison, and the thing I'd invited in was its warden. The air felt thick, damp, as though the walls themselves were breathing. The whisper came again, not from one voice, but many, overlapping and circling me like a predator toying with its prey. Thank you, Alex. Thank you for seeing. A tremor ran through me, so violent that I nearly fell. My mind scrambled for options, for an escape that didn't exist. The camera's light flickered again, and in its dim, stuttering glow, I saw it standing in the middle of the room. The figure had grown, its limbs impossibly elongated, nearly brushing the ceiling. It tilted its head, eyes wide and unblinking, pupils like twin voids. But this time, the grin was gone. The mouth was a thin, taut line, and it was moving, shaping words that I couldn't hear, but felt deep in my bones. I squeezed my eyes shut, as if that could block out the nightmare unfolding before me. The whispers swelled, a chaotic chorus that made the walls tremble, punctuated by a scraping, dragging sound, the sound of movement. It wasn't just standing still anymore. Alex. The voice, singular and commanding, was so close that I felt the vibrations in my chest. My eyes snapped open, and the room had changed. The hands that had pushed through the walls were now inches away, fingers curved, as if they would wrap around my throat at any moment. And the figure was right in front of me, its face a blur of pale skin and those awful glassy eyes. I couldn't scream. I couldn't even breathe. All I could do was stare as the figure leaned in, its head tilting further, almost upside down, those eyes locked on mine. When it spoke again, the voice was not just a whisper, but a guttural growl, layered with so many other voices it was impossible to tell where one ended and another began. We are here. We have always been here. And now, you see us. A searing pain exploded at the base of my skull, like a clawed hand reaching inside my head, twisting and pulling. The world fractured, splintering into fragments of light and shadow, as if reality itself was shattering. The room spun, the voices rising to a crescendo so loud it drowned out my heartbeat, my gasps, everything. Then suddenly, silence. I awoke in the living room, sprawled on the floor, drenched in sweat. Morning light filtered through the blinds, soft and indifferent, illuminating the mess around me. The camera lay a few feet away, its screen cracked, but still glowing faintly. My head throbbed, as if I had been hit with a sledgehammer, but I forced myself up, muscles protesting every movement. The apartment was silent, so painfully silent that it seemed impossible anything had happened at all. But I knew better. The memory of that night was etched into my mind, a scar that burned with an unexplainable certainty. I reached for the camera, my hand still trembling, and hit play on the lost recording. There was no hallway, no dragging footsteps or whispered words, just the sight of me in my apartment, staring wild-eyed at something off camera. And then, without warning, I turned to face the lens, but it wasn't me anymore. My eyes were wide, too wide, and my mouth twitched into a thin, joyless line. I leaned in, filling the screen until all that was visible was those eyes, unblinking and hollow. The video ended with a crackle of static and a single frame of text. You are never alone. I dropped the camera and backed away, my breath coming in shallow, broken gasps. The sunlight felt false, a thin veneer over the dark truth. I knew then that nothing would ever be the same. The figure had followed me, but worse, it was inside me now. The whispers hadn't left. They just lay dormant, waiting, listening, watching. And as I stared at the cracked screen one last time, I realized with bone-deep certainty that it wasn't over. The hands were still out there, pressing against reality, waiting for the moment when someone, somewhere, would open the door again. I discovered a dark web forum that discusses cursed items. My grandfather's watch was the first item on the list. I don't consider myself a tech wizard or anything, but I know my way around computers more than the average person. It started as innocent curiosity about the internet's shadowy underbelly, the so-called deep web. I'd read stories about it being home to shady marketplaces and hidden secrets. So naturally, I wanted to see if it was as wild as people said. You know, that teenager level, I'm invincible and nothing can scare me type of vibe. I was dead wrong. I never meant for things to go this far. I was just supposed to browse a few forums, maybe find some cryptic chat rooms, and call it a night. I didn't expect to stumble into something that would make my chest tighten with dread every time I remembered it. It was late, probably around 1 a.m., and the only sounds were the faint buzz of my computer and the occasional groan of the wooden floorboards as the house settled. My screen glowed with an eerie bluish light as I navigated through layers of links, with intentionally obscure names. Most of them led nowhere special. Old conspiracy theory pages, forgotten message boards, where the only posts were last updated in 2014, that sort of thing. But then I clicked on a link titled Threads of the Damned. It stood out, mostly because it had a surprisingly clean interface compared to the rest of the sites. No neon fonts on a black background or grainy gifs of skulls spinning. Just a minimalist design with a strange logo that looked like an Ouroboros, a snake eating its own tail, but in the shape of an infinity sign. I knew I should have stopped there. There's a line between curiosity and foolishness, and I had 1 foot over it. But I was hooked, and the moment I hit enter, there was no turning back. The page loaded with a list of forum threads. Each one had cryptic titles like the haunted piano of room 6B, the mirror that sees you back, and echoes of the unclaimed tomb. It was weird, but not too far off from urban legends or clickbait horror articles. What made my pulse quicken, though, was the top thread pinned in bold. The chronometer of shadows. First recorded cursed item. The thumbnail next to the thread froze my blood. It was an old, tarnished watch with a cracked face and hand stuck at 3:33. My heart thudded painfully as I squinted at the screen. I knew that watch. I knew it because it belonged to my grandfather. He had passed away when I was 10, and that watch was the one thing he always kept on him. Even at family gatherings, when he'd fall asleep in the corner chair, it would be there, clutched in his hand like it was the most valuable thing in the world. He never told us why it mattered so much, and we never asked. It was just part of him. I clicked on the thread before I could think better of it. The page opened with a chilling note at the top. This item has been associated with unexplained deaths and supernatural events. Its current location is unknown, but its history is documented for those who dare seek it. The hairs on my arms stood on end as I scrolled down. The thread was full of details, some of which I could hardly believe, but they had dates, names, and references. The watch first appeared in 1923, owned by a man named Thomas Ellaby. According to the thread, Ellaby had been found dead at his desk, eyes wide open and a look of unspeakable terror frozen on his face. The watch had been ticking, but stuck at 3:33. It disappeared after that, only to resurface in the belongings of a widow who claimed she'd never seen it before. She gifted it to her son, who fell from the second story of their home 2 weeks later. The thread went on to list story after story, each more bizarre and unnerving than the last. But the most recent post made my heart pound so loud, I was sure it would wake the entire house. Last seen in possession of Edward K., 2005. Passed to his grandson, known only as J. The current status is unknown. Beware. My hands were trembling now. Edward K. was Edward Cray, my grandfather, and I was J. I didn't know whether to laugh at how ridiculous it all sounded or throw my computer out the window. My grandfather's old watch, cursed. It sounded like something straight out of a B-movie. But the more I stared at that thread, the more it felt like I wasn't alone in the room. I could almost hear the faint ticking, sharp and rhythmic, though I knew there was no clock near me. I glanced at my bedroom shelf. There it was, buried under old photos and keepsakes, my grandfather's watch, its cracked face staring back at me, the hands pointing stubbornly at 3:33. And then, in the silence of my room, a single tap came from the watch's direction, like a knock from inside the glass. I backed up so fast that my chair almost tipped over. That's when my computer screen flickered and a new message appeared at the bottom of the thread. "Welcome back, Jay. We've been waiting." I sat there paralyzed, staring at the screen. The words were burning into my brain, and a cold sweat broke out across my skin. "Welcome back, Jay. We've been waiting." I blinked, hoping it was some kind of glitch or a sick joke, but deep down, I knew better. The room suddenly felt oppressive, like the air had thickened and pressed in around me. The glow of my computer screen cast long, thin shadows across my walls, making the old posters and furniture look alien. The single tap from the direction of my grandfather's watch replayed in my mind, gnawing at my nerves. It had to be a coincidence. It had to be. I pushed myself up, legs shaky, and walked over to the shelf. My grandfather's watch was there, exactly as it had been for years, unmoving, with its hands locked at 3:33. But now, it seemed different. The tarnished silver almost glistened in the low light, as if it had a heartbeat of its own. I reached out to touch it, hesitating when a tiny shiver ran down my spine. When my fingers finally brushed the cool metal, I flinched at a sudden, sharp sound. My phone, resting on my desk, buzzed once. The sound was so abrupt in the silence that I nearly jumped out of my skin. Turning back to my desk, I picked up the phone. There was a new text from an unknown number. "Do not wind it. Whatever you do, don't let it tick." My breath caught in my throat. I checked the sender's number, but it was just a string of garbled characters that didn't make any sense. Before I could process what was happening, another tap, louder this time, came from the watch. It wasn't a rattle or a creak. It was deliberate, like a fingernail tapping against glass. The room grew colder, and the dim light from the computer screen seemed to waver. I felt trapped between the urge to throw the watch out the window and the inexplicable need to understand what was happening. Who had sent that text? And why did they know about my grandfather's watch? My head spun with questions that only made the knot in my stomach tighten. Suddenly, my computer made a noise I hadn't heard in years. The chime of an old instant messaging app I thought I'd deleted ages ago. I whipped around, my heart hammering against my chest as the screen blinked with a new chat window. The username was a garbled mess, just like the text number. The message appeared line by line, each word making my pulse throb harder. "It's watching you. It always has." I wanted to scream, to pull the plug on my computer and run. But before I could, the room temperature seemed to plummet, and my breath puffed out in little clouds. The watch on the shelf gave one last, sharp tap, and the glass on its face cracked a little more, the fracture branching out like a spiderweb. I staggered back as a noise filled the room, a low, rhythmic ticking that resonated in my chest. But the watch wasn't moving. The hands were still stuck at 3:33. A noise from outside caught my attention. A scraping sound, as if something heavy was being dragged along the street. I swallowed hard and moved to the window. The street was mostly empty, just the usual parked cars and the faint glow of distant streetlights. But in the shadows at the far end, something shifted. A figure, tall and thin, stood motionless under the light, its face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. It was too far to make out any features, but I could feel its eyes on me, the stare cold and invasive. A surge of panic washed over me, and I stepped back from the window. When I glanced back at my computer, the chat window had changed. The message now read, "Do not let it in." I had read enough horror stories to know what came next. Whatever that thing was, I was sure it wasn't human. The watch seemed to hum, almost vibrate, as if it could sense my fear. It was suddenly clear that I wasn't just looking at a cursed item. I was holding an invitation for whatever lurked beyond the veil, something my grandfather must have known but never spoke about. I scrambled to shut the chat window, to close the browser, and sever whatever connection I'd made. But the screen wouldn't respond. The mouse froze, and the keys were useless. The ticking grew louder, echoing in the pit of my stomach. I turned back to the window, just in time to see the shadowy figure disappear, as if it had simply melted into the dark. The relief was short-lived. The sound came from downstairs, the faint creak of the old floorboards in the hallway, right beneath my room. I froze, listening as the slow, deliberate footsteps approached the staircase. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The old house, so familiar and safe moments ago, now felt like a cage. The footsteps paused at the bottom of the stairs. The air around me buzzed with tension, the ticking now a rapid drumbeat in my ears. I knew, with a sinking feeling, that whatever was down there was here because of the watch, because of me. And then, the first step on the stairs groaned under the weight of whatever was coming up. The sound of those footsteps on the stairs might as well have been a hammer pounding directly on my chest. Each creak, slow and deliberate, sent a jolt of terror through my body. I stood paralyzed, the icy chill in my room sinking into my bones. The air was so heavy that each breath felt like I was swallowing water. My mind raced, desperate to wake up from this nightmare, but the watch on the shelf sat defiantly, its cracked face reflecting the dim glow from my computer. Another step. The groan of the old wood seemed to vibrate in my skull. Whoever, or whatever, was on the other side of that staircase wasn't in a hurry. It knew I wasn't going anywhere. My eyes darted around the room, scanning for anything that could serve as a weapon. My heart thudded erratically as I settled on an old baseball bat leaning in the corner, dusty from years of neglect. I grabbed it with a shaking hand and pointed it toward the door like it was some kind of makeshift talisman. The ticking continued, faster now, almost synchronized with my heartbeat. I could hear the blood rushing in my ears, my vision narrowing as adrenaline coursed through me. The next step creaked, and then another. The thing was halfway up now, each deliberate movement taunting me. My phone buzzed again, the screen lighting up with the same unknown number. Do not let it enter your room. Whatever happens, do not engage it. Easy for them to say. My palms were slick with sweat, and I gripped the bat tighter, feeling my knuckles strain under the pressure. The final creak came, and silence settled over the house. The figure had reached the top of the stairs. The hallway light flickered, dimming as a shadow moved just outside my room. A sliver of darkness passed under the door, and the doorknob rattled gently, as if something was testing its weight. My breath came in short, shallow gasps, and I took a step back, eyes locked on that doorknob. It turned slowly, metal groaning, as it twisted. The room around me seemed to hold its breath. I glanced over at the watch, still motionless, hands stubbornly pointing to 3:33. My skin crawled as I noticed something else. The cracked glass was fogging up, like someone was breathing on it from the inside. A word began to form, appearing in smudged strokes across the glass. 3 letters, scrolled out one by one. R-U-N. Before I could react, the door creaked open an inch, then stopped. A cold, foul-smelling breeze seeped through the crack, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of damp earth and rotting leaves. My eyes watered as I backed up further, bumping against my desk. The chat window on my computer sprang to life again. A new message in bold red text. It's looking for the watch. Hide it now. Panic surged through me. Hide it. Where? There was no time to think. I snatched the watch off the shelf, its metal cold and almost buzzing against my skin. The ticking seemed to follow me, growing louder as I shoved the watch into an old shoebox full of childhood trinkets and pushed it deep under my bed. The moment it was out of sight, the atmosphere in the room shifted, like an invisible weight had been lifted, but the silence outside was anything but comforting. The door pushed open another inch, hinges screeching like a wounded animal. The crack was wide enough now that I could see a sliver of the hallway, dimly lit and empty. Empty, except for the shadow that stretched across the floor, too tall and too thin to belong to anything human. My pulse quickened, and I held my breath, waiting for the next move. The shadow shifted, pulling back as if retreating. My mind screamed at me to do something, lock the door, call for help, anything, but I was frozen in place. The faint sound of the ticking slowed, almost fading out completely, just as I felt a spark of hope that whatever was on the other side had given up. A new sound made my blood run cold. A whisper, low, scratchy, like dry leaves being crushed underfoot. It came from right behind the door. Where is the time? Each word was drawn out, dripping with malice. The doorknob twisted one final time before the door opened a crack wider. The shadow didn't move, but a single gnarled finger reached through the opening, the skin pale and stretched so thin that the bones beneath were almost visible. It scraped against the wood, leaving dark, greasy trails. My vision blurred as I tried to keep my focus. I felt the bat slip from my grip and clatter to the floor, the sound impossibly loud in the silence. The finger paused, and the shadow seemed to tilt, as if it were listening. My lungs ached from holding my breath, but I couldn't let go. Not now. Not with whatever was outside so close. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the finger withdrew, and the shadow receded down the hallway. The heavy silence that followed was suffocating. I waited, listening to the quiet, until I was sure the presence had gone. My knees buckled, and I sank to the floor, the bat rolling away from me. The watch under the bed remained silent, the glass now clear and innocent, as if it had never changed. My phone buzzed again, one final message, lighting up the screen. It will come back. Be ready. I didn't sleep that night, or the one after, and every time I glanced at the watch, I knew deep down that this was only the beginning. The days after that night bled into each other, each one a mess of nerves and exhaustion. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that every corner of the house hid something waiting, patient. My family didn't seem to notice my jumpiness, though they did give me strange looks when I flinched at small sounds or kept glancing over my shoulder. I kept the watch buried deep under my bed, wrapped in an old scarf to muffle any potential sound. But even then, at odd moments, I thought I could hear it, faintly ticking. Sometimes it would happen during the quietest moments, as I lay in bed at night, staring at the shadows shifting across the ceiling, or when I passed the doorway to my room and caught the faintest of clicks beneath the creak of the floorboards. The worst was when I found myself almost sleepwalking, drawn to the spot where I'd hidden it. I'd wake up half out of bed, my hand already reaching under, fingers brushing the shoebox before I came to my senses. Every time, I would retreat to the far corner of the room, shaking, whispering to myself that it was just my mind playing tricks. 3 nights after the initial encounter, I had a dream that felt too vivid to dismiss. I was standing in a dark forest, the trees gnarled and skeletal, their branches clawing at the starless sky. The air was thick with mist, swirling around me, making it hard to breathe. Somewhere in the distance, a familiar ticking echoed, steady and relentless. The sound drew me forward, guiding me down a narrow path that twisted and turned until I reached a clearing. In the center stood a table, carved from dark, unidentifiable wood. On it sat the watch, its cracked glass glinting under an invisible light. But I wasn't alone. A figure stood across from me, tall and thin, with a face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat and eyes that glowed faintly red, like embers. It reached out with a hand that looked more bone than flesh, gesturing for me to pick up the watch. The ticking grew louder, almost deafening now. The figure tilted its head, its mouth splitting into a grin, filled with teeth that were too sharp, too many. Time waits for no one, but for you, it listens, it whispered, the voice slithering through the air and wrapping around my ears like cold, wet cloth. I woke up gasping, drenched in sweat and clutching at my chest. The ticking now gone, but the phantom echo of it rattling in my skull. The next morning, I knew I couldn't just sit in my room and hope this would blow over. I needed answers, and I needed them fast. There had to be someone out there who knew more about this than I did. The deep web forum had been my starting point, but now I needed more tangible information. My fingers shook as I logged back in, half expecting the screen to flare to life with a new message from that unknown user. But it was quiet. I scrolled down the forum, eyes scanning the threads, until I found one titled, Artifacts and Their Keepers. It was a long thread filled with stories, warnings, and the occasional post from someone who claimed to have survived a cursed object. My eyes zeroed in on one post, more recent than the others. If you're reading this and have one of these items, you need to find an archivist. They are the only ones who can help. Do not trust anyone else. If you can't find one, prepare to face the shadowed one. I reread that sentence until it burned into my mind. The shadowed one, the figure in the hat. The memory of its grin sent a shiver through my entire body. I spent the rest of the day poring over every link I could find on archivists, but most of it was dead ends or cryptic clues that didn't make sense. The sun dipped below the horizon and a pale glow settled over the neighborhood. It wasn't until well after midnight that I found something promising. An old blog buried in the depths of the internet. It was barely formatted, the font a jumbled mess of type that shifted with every refresh. But one entry stood out, titled, The Curse Breakers and the Watch of Echoes. It detailed the story of a man named Tobias Stokes, an archivist who specialized in items tied to death, torment, and the unnatural. He had written about a watch that sounded too similar to my grandfather's to ignore. According to Stokes, the watch was a gateway of sorts, a timepiece that marked the moments when worlds brushed past one another. It was sought by beings that didn't belong, creatures trapped in the liminal space between life and what lay beyond. I waited, listening to the quiet until I was sure the presence had gone. My knees buckled, and I sank to the floor, the bat rolling away from me. The watch under the bed remained silent, the glass now clear and innocent, as if it had never changed. My phone buzzed again, one final message lighting up the screen. It will come back. Be ready. I didn't sleep that night, or the one after, and every time I glanced at the watch, I knew deep down that this was only the beginning. The days after that night bled into each other, each one a mess of nerves and exhaustion. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that every corner of the house hid something waiting, patient. My family didn't seem to notice my jumpiness, though they did give me strange looks when I flinched at small sounds or kept glancing over my shoulder. I kept the watch buried deep under my bed, wrapped in an old scarf to muffle any potential sound. But even then, at odd moments, I thought I could hear it, faintly ticking. Sometimes it would happen during the quietest moments, as I lay in bed at night, staring at the shadows shifting across the ceiling, or when I passed the doorway to my room and caught the faintest of clicks beneath the creak of the floorboards. The worst was when I found myself almost sleepwalking, drawn to the spot where I'd hidden it. I'd wake up half out of bed, my hand already reaching under, fingers brushing the shoebox before I came to my senses. Every time, I would retreat to the far corner of the room, shaking, whispering to myself that it was just my mind playing tricks. 3 nights after the initial encounter, I had a dream that felt too vivid to dismiss. I was standing in a dark forest, the trees gnarled and skeletal, their branches clawing at the starless sky. The air was thick with mist, swirling around me, making it hard to breathe. Somewhere in the distance, a familiar ticking echoed, steady and relentless. The sound drew me forward, guiding me down a narrow path that twisted and turned until I reached a clearing. In the center stood a table carved from dark, unidentifiable wood. On it sat the watch, its cracked glass glinting under an invisible light. But I wasn't alone. A figure stood across from me, tall and thin, with a face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat and eyes that glowed faintly red, like embers. It reached out with a hand that looked more bone than flesh, gesturing for me to pick up the watch. The ticking grew louder, almost deafening now. The figure tilted its head, its mouth splitting into a grin filled with teeth that were too sharp, too many. Time waits for no one, but for you. It listens, it whispered, the voice slithering through the air and wrapping around my ears like cold, wet cloth. I woke up gasping, drenched in sweat and clutching at my chest. The ticking now gone, but the phantom echo of it rattling in my skull. The next morning, I knew I couldn't just sit in my room and hope this would blow over. I needed answers, and I needed them fast. There had to be someone out there who knew more about this than I did. The deep web forum had been my starting point, but now I needed more tangible information. My fingers shook as I logged back in, half expecting the screen to flare to life with a new message from that unknown user. But it was quiet. I scrolled down the forum, eyes scanning the threads until I found one titled, Artifacts and Their Keepers. It was a long thread filled with stories, warnings, and the occasional post from someone who claimed to have survived a curse object. My eyes zeroed in on one post, more recent than the others. If you're reading this and have one of these items, you need to find an archivist. They are the only ones who can help. Do not trust anyone else. If you can't find one, prepare to face the shadowed one. I reread that sentence until it burned into my mind. The shadowed one, the figure in the hat. The memory of its grin sent a shiver through my entire body. I spent the rest of the day poring over every link I could find on archivists, but most of it was dead ends or cryptic clues that didn't make sense. The sun dipped below the horizon, and a pale glow settled over the neighborhood. It wasn't until well after midnight that I found something promising. An old blog buried in the depths of the internet. It was barely formatted, the font a jumbled mess of type that shifted with every refresh. But one entry stood out, titled, "The Curse Breakers and the Watch of Echoes." It detailed the story of a man named Tobias Stokes, an archivist who specialized in items tied to death, torment, and the unnatural. He had written about a watch that sounded too similar to my grandfather's to ignore. According to Stokes, the watch was a gateway of sorts, a timepiece that marked the moments when worlds brushed past one another. It was sought by beings that didn't belong, creatures trapped in the liminal space between life and what lay beyond. My eyes blurred as I read the final paragraph. The Shadowed One cannot touch the watch unless it is wound. To break the curse, it must be handed over willingly under the light of dawn. Any mistake, and the curse will claim another. I closed my laptop, the quiet of my room pressing in around me. The words echoed in my head, handed over willingly under the light of dawn. I glanced at the window, the first hint of light seeping into the sky. If Tobias Stokes was right, I only had a few hours left to figure out how to make this work. A knock sounded at the front door, 3 slow and deliberate taps. The sound resonated through the silent house, making my heart lurch into my throat. My phone buzzed on the desk, and I turned it over to see one final message. "It's here. Do not answer. Wait for dawn." I didn't dare move. Not when the silence was punctuated by a low, scratchy whisper just beyond the door. "Jay, time is up." The knocks at the front door turned into a rhythmic pounding that seemed to shake the entire house. My blood felt like ice in my veins, each beat matching the relentless ticking that echoed from beneath my bed. I crouched low, my breathing shallow, eyes darting to the window, where the sky was beginning to shift from inky black to the faintest hue of gray. Dawn was creeping closer, but it wasn't here yet. The whisper came again, softer this time, weaving through the crack at the bottom of the door. "Time for you to see." A shadow flickered across the hallway light, long and thin, moving too smoothly to be human. It glided past my door, paused, and then retraced its path, as if sensing my fear. My pulse drummed louder than the ticking, and my hands clutched at the old baseball bat, now lying useless at my side. I squeezed it tight, its wooden surface rough under my palms, more for the illusion of control than any real defense. The knocking stopped, but I knew it was only a reprieve. The silence that followed was deeper than before, the kind that seemed to absorb all sound. I strained to listen for any hint of movement, holding my breath until my chest burned. The faint tick, tick, tick from the watch under my bed was my only companion. Suddenly, the temperature in the room plummeted, and I could see my breath cloud in the thin light of dawn. The window glass frosted over, lines of jagged ice spreading like veins. My phone buzzed again, vibrating so hard it skidded a few inches across the desk. I hesitated, my eyes flitting between the hallway and the screen, before snatching it up with trembling fingers. The message was just 2 words, in all caps. "It's inside." A shiver shot down my spine, and before I could process it, the doorknob to my room twitched. It didn't turn, just shook, as if someone, or something, was testing the resistance. The bat slipped from my grip and hit the floor with a dull thud. The sound was enough to break the stillness. The doorknob twisted, slow and sure, and the door began to creak open inch by inch. A sliver of darkness seeped into the room, and with it came the stench of damp earth and something far more putrid, like a decaying animal carcass. My eyes watered as I stumbled back, feet tangling in the edge of my blanket. The door was now fully ajar, but there was no figure, no shape in the doorway. Just an emptiness so deep, it felt like it was staring back at me. Then I saw it, the shadow, long and thin, crawling into the room like liquid darkness. It slithered across the floorboards, stopping just short of my bed. My breath came in ragged gasps as I watched it hesitate, then rise, the blackness solidifying into a shape. The hat, wide-brimmed and low, tilted toward me. 2 pinpoints of red light blinked into existence where its eyes should have been. Time must move. Its voice was a rasp, the sound of dry leaves scraping against pavement. The watch under my bed seemed to respond, the ticking growing louder until it reverberated in my skull, making me dizzy. The shadowed one extended an arm, long and skeletal, its fingers ending in claw-like tips that glistened with an oily sheen. It reached for the spot where I'd hidden the watch. Desperation surged in me, overriding the fear that paralyzed my limbs. Tobias Stokes's words echoed in my mind, handed over willingly under the light of dawn. But the light wasn't strong enough yet, the sky still an uncertain gray. I needed to buy time. I lunged forward, sliding to my knees and grabbing the shoebox. The shadowed one froze, its head tilting as if it were curious. The fingers twitched, claws scraping against the floor in an impatient rhythm. "Not yet," I whispered, pulling the watch out, its cold surface vibrating in my grasp. The ticking sped up, filling the room with a manic energy. The red points in the creature's face narrowed, as if it understood my plan. It recoiled, then lunged, its form stretching and twisting as it tried to grasp the watch from my hands. I threw myself backward, dodging the shadow's outstretched limbs. My back hit the desk, and pain shot up my spine. The window, now frosted with the first rays of dawn's light, glowed with a pale golden hue. I knew I was running out of seconds, literal seconds, before this thing got what it came for. "I won't let you," I said, louder this time, my voice steadier than I felt. I clutched the watch to my chest, and for a split second, the ticking stopped. The silence was so sudden, so complete, that the world seemed to hold its breath. The shadowed one froze, the red eyes flaring with an unnatural brilliance. It screamed, a sound so high-pitched and piercing that I felt blood trickle from my ears. The light of dawn spilled into the room, fully now, bathing everything in a pale, cleansing glow. The creature hissed, its form flickering like a dying flame before it dissolved into a wisp of shadow that retreated through the crack at the bottom of the door and out of sight. My heart pounded so hard that my vision blurred, and I slumped against the desk, the watch still in my hand. The ticking had ceased completely. For the first time in days, I couldn't hear that cursed rhythm in the back of my mind. As the morning sun bathed the room in warmth, a sense of eerie calm settled over me. I didn't know what came next, or what the full implications were, but I knew one thing. I'd survived this night. The watch, now just an old, broken relic, felt lighter in my grip, as if its power had drained away with the dawn. My phone buzzed one last time. The screen displayed a single message from the unknown number. "You did well. Keep it safe, or pass it on before it stirs again." A chill ran down my spine as I realized the truth. The watch wasn't just cursed. It was a key. and whether I liked it or not, I was now its keeper. I found a dark web page detailing secret government operations. One of them mentions my last job. Alright, so here's the thing. I never expected a lazy Saturday afternoon to turn into the start of the most terrifying experience of my life. I'm talking heart-thudding, sweat-dripping, check every shadow kind of fear. And it all started with an old friend's message on a private chat board. His username was Zen0N99. I knew him from college, where we'd shared a knack for digging into corners of the internet most people pretend don't exist. But after graduation, we fell out of touch. Life happened. Jobs, bills, the usual. Then, out of nowhere, I see a blinking notification with his name. The message was short. Too short, considering we hadn't spoken in years. Ever wonder how deep it goes? I found something. Meet me in the usual spot. For those of you who don't know, the usual spot was code for a forum buried in layers of encryption and anonymity. It wasn't technically deep web, but more like an underground clubhouse where people swapped stories about everything from cryptid sightings to lost files found on abandoned servers. I hadn't logged in there in years, but the urge to find out what he'd found gnawed at me. So I clicked, booted up my old Tor browser, and logged in. When I entered, Zenerin99 was already online, his icon pulsing in that annoying way that screamed urgency. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Check your DMs," he wrote, then logged out immediately. The sudden exit made my palms dampen. This wasn't like him. Back in college, he'd always stayed to chat, half joking about the next dumb thing he'd found. This time, he was gone before I could even type a response. I opened the DM. It was a link, one that led deeper than anything I'd been brave enough to explore before. A warning in red text blared at the top. This site contains unverified information that could be harmful to your safety. Proceed at your own risk. I hesitated for a moment, my cursor hovering over the link. Every logical part of my brain screamed to close the browser and go binge some mind-numbing show. But curiosity, that whispering, insidious voice, pushed me to click. The page took longer to load than any I'd seen before. It wasn't flashy, no creepy graphics or blood-red fonts, just a stark black background with rows and rows of text. But as my eyes skimmed the headers, the knot in my stomach tightened. These weren't just rumors or vague conspiracy theories. Each one had dates, locations, project code names. Some had scanned documents with grainy, smudged signatures that sent chills down my spine. Project Black Door, Operation Ruby Veil, names that sounded like the stuff of spy novels. But one caught my eye immediately. Project Echo Junction. And here's the thing. Echo Junction wasn't just familiar. It was the name of the government contract I'd worked on in my last job. The same job I quit after a mysterious software error cost a man his life. My pulse quickened, and I leaned forward, reading faster. There, under the header, was a detailed account of Echo Junction. It wasn't just about data processing or defense tech like I'd been told. The report described crowdsourced neurological patterns, experiments involving sound frequencies that could supposedly manipulate behavior en masse. I remembered the vague discussions at work, the questions I wasn't allowed to ask. I thought it was just classified military stuff, maybe testing the limits of crowd control technology. But it wasn't. I kept reading, my eyes now darting from side to side like they were trying to escape my head. The document detailed an incident. The words felt like ice sliding down my spine. During trial alpha, field test malfunction resulted in subject 107 exhibiting acute paranoia, followed by permanent neurological damage. I clicked the attachment linked beneath the text. My screen lit up with a video thumbnail, a security camera feed. The timestamp matched my last week at that job, but it was the location that made my blood run cold. The video was taken in my old department, the same building I'd worked in every day. The camera's frame showed a sterile office space lit by buzzing fluorescent lights, and right there, standing by the window, was a man I recognized too well. Michael Ross, my coworker, the one who disappeared the day after the supposed software failure. My heart drummed in my ears as I pressed play. The footage started out normal, Michael flipping through files, sipping coffee. But then, his body stiffened, like he'd heard something imperceptible. His eyes widened, and his fingers began to twitch in odd, rhythmic motions. He turned to the camera, eyes empty yet full of some horrible realization, and mouthed something that made me freeze. "They know." The screen glitched, the feed cutting in and out. His expression shifted from terror to rage, then suddenly, calm. The video ended abruptly, but not before I heard a faint, barely there sound. It was something I'd dismissed countless times at work as static interference. A low, warbling tone that made my chest tighten. I didn't realize I was holding my breath until I exhaled, shakily, into the silence of my living room. Then my phone vibrated against the desk, and I nearly knocked it over grabbing it. The screen displayed an unknown number. I hesitated, feeling the room press in around me. Finally, I answered, whispering, "Hello." There was nothing but a faint hum, followed by a deep, gravelly voice that whispered one word before disconnecting. "Run!" The word echoed in my mind long after the call ended, like it had burned itself into my thoughts. Run. It was impossible to shake that voice, deep and throaty, like someone speaking through layers of static. For a moment, I just sat there, the room silent except for the slow tick of my old wall clock. I stared at my phone, half expecting it to ring again, but nothing happened. Every rational part of me screamed that this was just a prank, some elaborate hoax. But then I remembered the video. Michael Ross's vacant eyes, the way he'd mouthed those words. "They know." My pulse was pounding hard enough to hurt. With a deep breath, I tried to steady my hands and clicked out of the dark web page, shutting down my Tor browser. The screen flickered, and for a split second, I thought I saw something, just a flash of red letters, there and gone before I could process it. I slammed my laptop shut and stood up, the sudden movement making my chair topple over behind me. My apartment, which had always been a cozy mess of books, mugs, and scattered electronics, felt suddenly foreign. Every shadow looked deeper, darker, like something might be lurking just out of sight. I walked to the window and pulled the curtain aside. The street below was quiet, lit by the orange glow of an old street lamp. Everything seemed normal, too normal. My mind felt split in two, one part desperately rational, trying to come up with logical explanations, while the other spiraled, connecting dots that should have stayed unconnected. There had to be an explanation for this. Maybe Zenjoran 99 had found an old file, a forgotten government scare project that someone had leaked. But deep down, I knew better. The memories started to resurface, those subtle, unsettling details from my last days at that job. The weak Michael Ross vanished. There were whispers in the office, the kind that stopped the moment you walked into a room. I'd catch glimpses of people staring at computer screens, eyes glazed, faces pale. And then there was the sound, that low, almost subsonic hum that seemed to come from nowhere. People joked about it, blaming old wiring or faulty air conditioning. But after Michael disappeared, no one joked anymore. I walked back to my desk and reached for my laptop. Every instinct told me to throw it out the window and forget everything, but I needed answers. If Zen's 9 had found this, someone else could too. Maybe it was already too late. I hesitated before opening the laptop, my hand hovering over the lid. It felt like breaking a seal, opening a door I couldn't close again. When I finally pried it open, the screen was black, but the power was still on. I pressed a few keys, but nothing changed. A cold chill ran down my spine when I noticed the faint sound playing from the speakers, just at the edge of hearing. That warbling tone. I slammed the laptop shut again, breathing hard. The sound continued for a second longer, then cut out with a soft pop. My heart was racing, and my mouth was dry. I grabbed my phone and texted Zen 099. What did you find? This isn't a game. We need to talk. The reply came instantly, almost like he'd been waiting. They're watching. Delete everything. Get out. I stared at the message until my vision blurred. That same prickling feeling crept over my skin, like being watched. I turned, scanning my living room. The shadows felt closer, more suffocating. I stood and moved to the door, peeking through the peephole. The hallway outside was empty, just the familiar stretch of drab carpet and dull lighting. But then, just as I was about to step back, a figure moved past the end of the hall. It was fast, barely a flicker of motion, but enough to make my stomach twist. Someone was out there. I stepped back, slowly, not daring to make a sound. My mind raced. Maybe it was just a neighbor coming home late. But in that moment, I realized how little comfort that thought brought. The doorbell rang. Once, twice, 3 times in quick succession. The sound was sharp, almost angry. My whole body went cold. I edged toward the door again, heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst. Through the peephole, I could see a tall, dark silhouette. No face, no features, just the broad frame of someone who didn't belong there. "Who is it?" I called, trying to keep my voice steady. Silence. No movement, no response. Just that hulking figure standing in front of my door like it had all the time in the world. Seconds stretched into minutes. My breath came in shallow gasps. I glanced at my phone, still clutched in my trembling hand, and quickly dialed Zen 099's number. It rang once, twice, then a sudden, loud click. "Get out, now." His voice was panicked, more frantic than I'd ever heard. "They know you're involved. You need to go." "But where?" I hissed, glancing back at the peephole. The figure was gone. "Somewhere public, somewhere with people. Don't go to your car, and don't stay on the line." He hung up before I could say anything else. I felt trapped in my own apartment, every familiar corner now a potential hiding spot for whatever was out there. But Zenzoron 99 was right. Staying here wasn't an option. I grabbed a jacket, stuffed my phone in my pocket, and pushed a chair under the door handle as a makeshift barricade. It wouldn't hold for long if someone really wanted to get in, but it was better than nothing. I forced myself to breathe, counting to 3 before swinging open the window. The fire escape was rusted, creaking under my weight, but it held as I climbed down to the alley below. The cold air bit at my face, clearing my head for just a second. I dropped to the ground and looked around. The alley was empty, but every shadow felt alive, shifting in the dim glow of a streetlight at the far end. I moved fast, sticking close to the walls. The city at night had always been my comfort. A background hum of cars, distant voices, the occasional bark of a dog. But tonight, every sound made my nerves tighten. I reached the main street and ducked into the first 24-hour diner I found, its neon sign buzzing above the door. Inside, the harsh fluorescent lights felt like a blessing. The place was mostly empty, save for a bored-looking waitress and an old man nursing a cup of coffee in the corner. I slid into a booth at the back, facing the door. My phone buzzed. A new message from Zen099. It's worse than I thought. They don't just know. They're inside. I stared at the message, heart hammering in my chest. It wasn't just paranoia or some twisted joke. The hairs on my arm stood up as I slowly glanced around the diner, eyes searching for anything out of place. The old man shifted in his seat, raising his head, and when his eyes met mine, he smiled. A slow, knowing smile. And then, in a voice that dripped with familiarity, he mouthed the word, "Run." That smile. It wasn't the friendly, absent-minded smile of an old man sitting in a diner. It was something else entirely, something colder, calculated. The word "run" sat on his lips, like a secret he wanted me to know. He didn't move after that, didn't say anything else, just stared at me, with eyes that glistened under the fluorescent lights. A shiver traced my spine, and the room seemed to close in, shrinking until the hum of the neon sign outside and the hiss of the coffee machine behind the counter blurred into a single, low roar in my ears. The waitress glanced over, chewing gum, barely interested in the drama unfolding in her otherwise dead shift. I forced myself to look away from the old man and fumbled for my phone, hands shaking as I typed a hurried message to Zenchron99. "Someone's here. What do I do?" The response came almost immediately. "Stay calm. Watch. Don't trust anyone." My eyes flicked back to the old man. He turned away, staring at his cup as if nothing had happened. But I couldn't shake the feeling that every move I made was being scrutinized, catalogued. I turned my attention to the window, scanning the dark street for any sign of movement. And then I saw it, a shadow at the corner, lingering just outside the cone of light cast by the street lamp. It shifted, disappearing for a moment, before reappearing closer, at the edge of the diner's glow. My stomach twisted as I realized it wasn't just standing there. It was pacing, back and forth, like a wolf circling its prey. The bell above the door chimed, sharp and sudden, making me jump. A man in a dark hoodie walked in, head down, moving with deliberate steps. He slid into a booth near the entrance and sat facing me, though his eyes stayed hidden beneath the shadow of his hood. The waitress rolled her eyes and walked over, pen tapping against her order pad. "Coffee?" she asked, bored. The man nodded without looking up. His hands, pale and thin, drummed on the table. My gaze dropped to his knuckles, where faded letters spelled out something that made my throat tighten. ECHO. I snapped my head away, pretending to focus on the menu, though I could feel his eyes boring into me. The hum of the diner felt suffocating now, every sound amplified. The old man across the room stirred, coughing lightly into his napkin. It was almost synchronized, like a signal, and the hooded man's drumming fingers stopped. Dead silence. I swallowed hard and looked back at my phone. Another message from Zen099 lit up the screen. "Leave. Now side exit." My muscles tensed, ready to spring. I slid out of the booth slowly, trying not to draw attention. The waitress was busy refilling the old man's coffee, and the hooded figure had turned to look out the window, his profile blank and unreadable. My eyes darted to the side exit at the far end of the diner, a narrow, grimy door that might as well have been salvation wrapped in peeling paint. Taking a deep breath, I made my move. I walked quickly, not quite running, just a steady, anxious pace that had my heart thundering against my ribs. The old man's voice rang out behind me, suddenly loud and clear. "Leaving so soon?" I didn't stop. I didn't even look back. My hand slammed into the exit bar, and I pushed through, stumbling into the cool night air behind the diner. The alleyway was tight, lined with dumpsters and the sour stench of old grease, but it was empty. For a moment, the silence was a relief, the air itself like a gasp of freedom. Then, a sound. Soft footsteps, almost cautious, echoed down the alley. I turned, expecting to see the old man or the hooded figure, but what I saw made my breath catch. A woman stood at the far end of the alley, partially hidden by shadows. She wore a dark trench coat, and her hair fell in tangled waves around her face. But it was her eyes that locked me in place, unblinking, too wide, reflecting the dim light in an unnatural way. She took a step forward, and I noticed her hands were balled into fists so tight, her knuckles were bone white. "You shouldn't have looked," she said, her voice hollow, like it was being filtered through static. I backed away, my palms scraping against the rough brick wall. The world around me felt warped, like the street was subtly shifting, the walls bending inward. The hum was back, that low, teeth-rattling sound that seemed to crawl up from my feet and settle in my skull. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I fumbled to answer it, my fingers barely working. It was Zen 099. His voice came through, urgent but muffled, as though he was speaking from inside a tunnel. "Listen carefully. They're using sound. It disorients, makes you see things. You have to get away from any electronic signal." The woman stepped closer, eyes still fixed on me. Her lips parted as if she was going to say something else. Instead, she opened her mouth wider. A long, mechanical tone emerged, vibrating through the air, the same sound that had haunted the edges of my memory for days. I dropped the phone. The noise drilled into my mind, sending sharp spikes of pain behind my eyes. My knees buckled, and I hit the ground hard, the world spinning. The woman's silhouette loomed over me, but now she was joined by the hooded man, his face still obscured, and the old man from the diner, his smile wider, stretched impossibly long, my vision blurred, dark spots creeping into the corners. The old man's voice whispered, even though his lips didn't move. "They're inside. Echoes in your head." And then everything went black. I woke up to the cold bite of the night air on my face, lying on the damp ground behind the diner. The street beyond was silent, empty. The first rays of dawn stained the sky, a bruised purple. My body felt like it had been dragged through glass, muscles sore and mind foggy. I pushed myself to sit up, glancing around for any sign of the figures from before. They were gone, but I wasn't alone. My phone was lying in the dirt beside me, screen cracked but still functioning. A new message was open, waiting for me to read it. "You can't run forever. They don't need to find you. They're already inside." I dropped the phone like it burned. In the distance, the early morning city was starting to stir. The hum of life, so normal, felt wrong now, tainted. Because now I understood. It wasn't just a project, a forgotten experiment buried in classified files. Project Echo Junction was something that never stopped, never left. It was a sound, an idea, a virus that had taken root, and somehow I was part of it now. The city felt louder than ever, each sound carrying an echo that only I could hear, and with every beat of my heart, that warbling tone rose again, deep inside my head, promising one thing: I was never alone. The city came alive around me, shaking off the chill of the night. The noise was a tapestry of honking horns, distant construction work, and the shuffle of early risers heading to work. Normally, these sounds would have been a comfort, a sign that the world kept moving regardless of my spiraling life. But now, each noise felt like a needle pressing into my mind, whispering something I couldn't quite understand. The low, warbling hum was still there, threading through everything, deeper than before, more insistent. I needed to think, needed space. Stumbling to my feet, I took a moment to steady myself. The alley, once a forgotten vein of the city, now felt like a battleground, every shadow hiding an echo of the figures from last night. I retrieved my phone from the ground. The cracked screen buzzed under my thumb as I unlocked it. Another notification from Zen099 flashed across the screen, and I swiped it open with shaking hands. You need to get to a place without signal. Total silence. It's your only shot. Total silence. In a city this alive, it felt impossible. But deep down, I knew what he meant. The tone, the whispers, the things I'd seen. They were using every piece of modern life as their vessel. Every phone, every speaker, every wire was a vein for that cursed sound to travel through. I shoved the phone into my pocket and moved quickly down the alley, skirting past dumpsters and old cardboard boxes that crunched under my feet. My mind was a storm, and every thought tripped over another. I needed to move, needed to find somewhere that wouldn't pulse with the digital heartbeat of the city. The subway station yawned ahead, its entrance dark, littered with papers and stray wrappers. The city's hum grew as I descended the steps, the low thrum of train engines, mixing with the voices of commuters and the crackle of a nearby busker's speaker. My heart pounded as I navigated the crowd, the cacophony rising with every step. I tried to block it out, but the sound was different now. It wasn't just noise. It was part of that terrible tone, hidden under the chorus of city life, waiting for me to tune into it. A train roared past, sending a gust of wind that ruffled my clothes and whipped against my face. The warbling sound in my head wavered, intensifying, almost like it was aware I was trying to get away. I caught a glimpse of my reflection in a cracked piece of glass on the wall. My face was pale, eyes hollowed with fear and exhaustion, and behind me, just over my shoulder, stood a silhouette. It wasn't moving, wasn't even solid, more like a smudge on the surface of reality. My heart froze as it shifted slightly, a shadow that shouldn't be there. Before I could turn, a voice crackled through the intercom system above, metallic and warped. But it wasn't announcing trains or warnings. It spoke directly to me. You're getting close, but they won't let you leave. My breath caught, and the air felt thick, like I was inhaling water. The people around me moved on, as if nothing had happened, eyes glued to their phones, ears plugged with headphones. They couldn't hear it, couldn't feel that suffocating pressure building in the station. I bolted, weaving through the crowd and taking the emergency exit stairs 2 at a time. Each step echoed in a hollow, metallic clang that rang in my head. When I burst out onto the street, I nearly tripped over my own feet and fell into a stumbling run. I needed to find somewhere far from the constant pulse of the city, A place where there was no Wi-Fi, no hum of wires, nothing but silence. There was only one place I could think of that fit the bill. It was a long, breathless jog to the outskirts of town, past rows of buildings that grew older and more decrepit with each block. My destination loomed ahead. An old factory, abandoned since before I was born. It sat like a rusted sentinel at the edge of the city, surrounded by chain-link fences that had long since been torn open by vagrants and time. No one came out here anymore, not even the bravest of urban explorers. I ducked through a gap in the fence, the chain-link scraping at my jacket. The ground was uneven, littered with broken glass and weeds that had grown wild. The silence here was different, heavy, almost sacred. I pushed forward, each step crunching underfoot, until I found an entry point, a rusted door hanging on bent hinges. With a shove, I was inside, the echo of my intrusion swallowed by the vast emptiness of the factory. The silence was deafening, pressing down like a weight. I stood in the middle of the room, catching my breath, ears straining for any hint of that sound. But for the first time in hours, there was nothing. No hum, no warbling tone, just stillness. I pulled out my phone, the cracked screen flashing up at me. Another message from Zen099. They'll follow the signal. Ditch your phone. My fingers hovered over it, hesitating. This was my last tether to Zen099, the only lifeline I had in this nightmare. But as I stared at the fractured glass, the warbling hum sparked to life in my mind, faint but there, rising like a predator scenting blood. With a final, reluctant breath, I hurled the phone into the darkness. The screen shattered further as it skidded across the concrete and slammed against an old, rusted machine. The hum cut out, severed cleanly, leaving nothing but the sound of my breathing. Minutes passed, stretching out like hours. My legs shook, and I sank to the floor, eyes darting to every corner, every shadow. The silence remained, deep and vast. But the comfort was short-lived. A metallic clink echoed from deeper in the factory, a sound too precise to be anything accidental. I froze, muscles tensed, as the noise repeated. Clink, clink. A slow, measured sound, like footsteps on metal stairs. The darkness seemed to shift and settle, forming shapes that swayed in and out of view. Shapes that became more human the longer I stared. One by one, the figures emerged. People, but not people. Shapes that mimicked humanity with stiff, jerky movements. Their faces were obscured, eyes reflecting the faint glint of moonlight that managed to seep through the broken windows. And then the sound returned, not from any speaker, but from their mouths, opened too wide and vibrating with that low, warbling tone. I pressed my hands to my ears, trying to block it out. The factory, once silent, was now a concert of dissonant notes, each figure joining in, their bodies trembling with the sound. It pulsed against my skull, worming its way through my mind, bringing with it that suffocating alien presence. It was as if they were trying to drag me into their song, a sound that was not just heard, but felt, a vibration that wrapped around my bones. They moved forward, limbs jerking like marionettes, the gaze never leaving mine. I stumbled back, heart thundering, until my back hit cold, rusted metal. The warble rose, a symphony of madness echoing in the hollow space, closing in. I screamed, a raw, desperate sound swallowed by the cacophony. But through it all, one thought seared through my fear. This was why Michael had mouthed those words, why he had looked at the camera, eyes wide with a truth too terrifying to comprehend. They were inside, and now they wanted me too. The factory roared with that discordant, bone-deep sound, pressing in on me from all sides. The figures moved in unison, their mouths gaping as the warble became more than just noise. It became something alive, vibrating through the metal and the cracked concrete beneath me. My vision blurred, sweat and fear soaking into my clothes. I pressed my palms harder against my ears, desperate to block out the sound. It wasn't working. The hum bypassed every barrier, drilling straight into my mind, making my teeth chatter and my thoughts splinter. The room spun, shadows twisting into jagged, sharp shapes that seemed to reach out and writhe like living things. Think, I commanded myself. There has to be a way out. Suddenly, a sharp memory pierced through the chaos, as vivid as the day it happened. The day Michael Ross disappeared. He had whispered something to me in the break room. His eyes were haunted, darting around as if he expected someone to pounce. It's the silence they fear. True silence. True silence. The words jolted me back into the present, my gaze flickering across the rusted remnants of factory machinery. There had to be a way to make it stop. The hum around me escalated, the figures drawing closer, their limbs twitching with unnatural tension. My heart slammed against my ribs, desperation clawing up my throat as I pushed myself upright, legs shaking. Then I saw it. An old electrical panel, half torn from the wall, wires spilling out like mechanical veins. It might have been functional once, but now it was nothing more than a cluster of metal and frayed cords. Yet among the chaos of broken switches, one panel glowed faintly with a sputtering red light. A generator. My last shot. I sprinted toward it, every step a fight against the growing vibration in my body. The figures reacted instantly, moving faster, their sound warping into a frenzied chorus. One of them lurched forward, a woman whose eyes were as hollow and reflective as a mirror. Her fingers reached out, skeletal and too long. I ducked at the last second, the cold brush of her fingertips grazing my shoulder like ice. I hit the panel hard, the impact numbing my shoulder. Fingers trembling, I yanked open the rusted door and searched for the right switch. The glow of the red light bathed the controls in a sickly hue, and I realized, with a sinking feeling, that half the labels were worn away, unreadable. The figures advanced, the warble shifting to a sharp, piercing note that made my vision blur and ears bleed. Now or never. I grabbed the biggest switch and pulled. The room shuddered as a deep, mechanical groan echoed through the factory. The figures froze, their eyes flickering with an unnatural glow. The warble faltered, skipping like a broken record. For a brief, terrifying moment, everything was still, a vacuum of tension so sharp it cut. Then the lights went out. True silence enveloped the room, heavy and absolute. I stood in the darkness, panting, heart slamming against my ribs. The figures didn't move. Whatever unnatural force had driven them, had sung through them, seemed to short out with the power cut. One by one, their heads tilted, mouths closing, as if a switch had been flipped off inside them. My ears rang with the echo of the lost tone, but it was fading. The silence around me felt like a shield, a rare and sacred thing that blocked out everything else. I edged backward, eyes trained on the shadowed outlines of the figures. They remained eerily still, like mannequins abandoned mid-stride. I didn't wait to see if the silence would hold. My feet found their way through the dark, feeling out broken floorboards and scattered debris, until I reached the cracked door I'd entered through. The cool night air hit my face, sharp and refreshing, as I stumbled into the open space outside the factory. A sliver of dawn brushed the edges of the sky, and the city was waking up, its hum distant, as if afraid to come too close. For the first time, I welcomed the cold wind, the sensation grounding me, proving I was still here, still real. I didn't have my phone. I didn't care. The thought of touching anything electronic sent a shudder through me. Instead, I kept walking, putting distance between myself and that place, feet crunching on gravel, each step pulling me further from the echoes that still tingled faintly at the edge of my mind. A sudden movement caught my eye. Across the street, a figure stood under a dimming street lamp, watching. My heart clenched, ready to race again, but then I recognized the coat, the slouch, the mess of unkempt hair. It was him, Zen 099. He stepped forward, the street lamp casting deep shadows across his gaunt face. He looked older, eyes lined with exhaustion, but there was a spark of relief as he met my gaze. Without a word, he raised a hand, beckoning me over. I approached, warily, glancing over my shoulder at the factory that now seemed like a sleeping giant. "You survived," he said, voice hoarse. He glanced behind me, then back, his eyes narrowing. "But you need to know something." "What?" My voice was barely a whisper. "The silence isn't permanent. They're only stunned. And next time, they'll be smarter." The last remnants of dawn split the sky, casting long, thin rays of light across the city that stretched like grasping fingers. The hum of life picked up again, distant and soft, a reminder that nothing ever truly stays silent, not for long. The warble, now faint but undeniable, hummed in the back of my mind, a warning and a promise.